All right. So usually I prefer presenting through documents rather than slides. And I've been playing around with Coda recently, a new like document creation website. So I figured I would present through their product. And I'll be running through a product interviewing toolkit. So let's go through it. The first section here is kind of a overview. And also this entire thing will be shared afterwards. So you all can access the doc itself outside as well. But I'll just kind of walk through it. So just a quick overview for myself. I've been doing product for about 9 years. Most recently, I was at Lyft for about 3 as a senior PM. And one of the things that I've always really enjoyed doing is actually interviewing. I get made fun of a lot by my friends that I do more interviews than like anyone that they know. It's genuinely fun for me to go through these sort of exercises with different companies and learn about how they think about different problems and make connections. All things that I'll kind of talk through throughout this presentation. And as a result, I've also ended up doing a lot of coaching and mentoring around interviewing. I've mentored probably dozens at least of people, aspiring and current PMs, and how to get their next job. And these are basically all the different learnings that I talk through if we were to have a conversation one-on-one. Great. So let's go into the next section, which is as a starting point, how to get the interview. So this is basically I break this down into 2 different sections, one of which is like how do you get the interview, and the other one is how do you do well on the interview. And this is the first part of that. So how to get the interview, it really comes down to 2 things. It's who you know and having a good web presence through your resume and LinkedIn. So first step here is don't just submit your resume to any job that you want. Typically, of course, all these companies are going to have a careers page with a job profile that lets you submit your resume. If you do just that by itself, there's a very low chance that someone will reach out to you, no matter how much experience you have, no matter how strong of a candidate you really are. I face this personally. I know a lot of folks who face the same. The real way to get in is to know somebody and have them refer you internally. And there's a couple different ways that you can do this. One is if you know somebody on the inside, a friend or an old colleague, of course, reach out to them and tell them that you're interested, and they can refer you internally and even like contact the specific hiring manager or recruiter to get you in the process. That's the best way to do it. The next best way is honestly just cold emailing. There actually have been quite a few different recruiting conversations or interviews that I've had that started off with me finding a company, looking them up on LinkedIn, finding somebody in the company who maybe have a second connection to, and ask somebody who I know to intro me to them, or worst case scenario, try to guess what their email is and send them an email asking to do like an informational interview, which is just meant to learn about how they think about the work in their company. And if all goes well, ask them at the end of that to make an introduction to get me to the process. So these are all the different ways that you can go about getting your foot in the door. Now, of course, if somebody is looking at your profile earnestly and wants to interview you, you still have to make sure that your resume and your LinkedIn all look great. And there's plenty of resources all over the internet on this. I'd say specifically for product, some of the things that are the most important to note are that your resume should focus on impact primarily. So you want to make sure that all of the numbers that you've driven impact around, growing X metric or providing user value as measured by retention or engagement or anything else, those sort of metrics are all foregrounded on your resume. And by that I mean like one of the first bullets for each job and leftmost as well. Think of yourself like in a recruiter's shoes. You're probably looking through dozens or hundreds of resumes, and even if someone on the inside referred you, they still want to go quickly through all their work. So you want them to, within like 10 seconds, be able to glance and see the most important parts of what you've done in past roles. So now let's go into preparing for the interview. So now let's say you've done a great job of getting your foot in the door. They've seen your resume, your LinkedIn. They think that it all looks good, and now it's time to prepare. So a couple of thoughts here. First and foremost, it can be really exciting to interview, especially if you're me and you really enjoy it. But no matter how excited you are about the idea of talking to a bunch of companies, and no matter how many companies you'd be interested in working at, make sure you pace yourself. Don't interview at more than 2 or 3 companies at once. And the reason for that is, let's say you start doing well in interviews and you get sent over to a bunch of final on-sites. You might accidentally find yourself doing 4 or 5 full-day on-sites, one after another. And obviously, if you're currently employed, that's really hard to manage logistically. But even if you're unemployed and you're fully open, it's just very mentally taxing, right? So you want to make sure that you keep it to around 2 or 3, and that you're able to space out all of these different interviews, especially as you get to the latter stages with each company. Also, it's important to give yourself a lot of time to practice. No matter how much time you spent, in the role already conducting interviews. Like I'm like pretty experienced in doing interviews, but even for myself, when I go out and do interviews, I actually do pretty poorly if I haven't personally practiced beforehand. So even for myself, I find it really important to spend a lot of time practicing doing mock interviews with friends before I go into a serious interview that I care a lot about. One more thought here is there are a lot of different ways out there to get mentorship around interviewing. There's even websites that will give you like really in-depth coaching with professional interview coaches, actually myself included. But I wouldn't even recommend starting with that. I think a great way to start is just to have a few friends that you interview with, or even a higher stakes and more effective way could be to just actually do some interviews at companies that you aren't the most excited about. Now, obviously, you should be mindful about this. Like, we don't want to waste the time of hiring managers or folks who earnestly want to interview with us. So don't just do this like a ton. But I think there's nothing wrong with going for like one or two companies that you would be interested in working at potentially, but wouldn't be upset about not getting the offer at, and maybe start off your search with them. And this way, you'll warm up. If you don't do a great job, hopefully the hiring manager, the recruiter would give you some feedback, also what you can do to improve. And this is a great way to kind of get your feet wet and get used to it. Now, as I mentioned, there are a lot of different ways to practice outside of doing actual interviews. At the end of this document, which again will be shared after the presentation, have some practice problems that you can run through. And even they have some like curveballs that you can like reveal as you go through them. I'll show you later. It's pretty fun. And even besides that, you can go through different services that provide you professional interview coaching. There's plenty of prep videos and courses on YouTube and in other websites. So plenty of different ways to practice. So now let's talk about how PM interviews are actually structured. And so this is kind of beginning to end. So let's say, again, you got your foot in the door, someone referred to you, your resume was good. You start off with a recruiter phone screen. And this is pretty much the case across most companies, unless they have only a couple of employees. Maybe the hiring manager will talk to you first, but usually it's the recruiter. Either way, the goal of this initial call is mostly just to talk about your experience, not really in a high level of detail, and mostly just to talk you through the process, explain to you what the role is, gauge your interest, make sure that you are generally aligned in terms of the subject matter, and that you would be excited about the role. They're not going to ask you at this stage to go in depth about some product that you launched and your learnings, or give you a case study. This happens sometimes. Like some companies do this. It's usually a surprise to me whenever that happens, but for the most part, they just want to kind of gauge your general area of experience and if you'd be interested in the role. The first big section is usually, especially with medium to large size companies, is a initial phone screen. And depending on the company, it's going to be one or two usually interviews. And obviously during coronavirus now, all of the interviews are over the phone or video. But even in a world where there are in-person on-sites, the initial phone screen is usually over the phone or over video. And usually the way that these work, again, depending on the company, is you get asked some sort of a product sense or execution question, or if there's two interviews, maybe one of each. And we'll get soon into how to think about those sort of problems. If you pass both of those initial screens, then typically you go straight to the final on-site. Some companies might have a second or like a third round at the end, but usually it's kind of this like initial and then final on-site. In the final on-site, again, depending on the company, it can be between 3, 4, maybe 5 interviews that you do, again, usually in person, but in this case, all virtual. And during these, you get asked, essentially, it really boils down with most companies to 3 different sections. One of them is the product sense question, which again, we'll get into more later. Another one is around execution. And there's this other one around behavioral and leadership. We'll talk about it in more detail soon, but the idea there is it's more around like how you think about like managing conflict or working with large teams and coordinating and those sort of issues. And for all these sort of things, you're probably not going to be asked those questions on the initial, but on the final onsite, they'll lean a lot more heavily towards that because you're at the end of the process. Now, there are a couple other types of interviews or interview sessions that some companies do. So for example, like Google does technical questions. They also do estimation questions, which we'll talk about soon. Some companies do like a product strategy session, which is a bit different from a product sense question, but as we'll get into, they're roughly similar. And especially as you get more and more senior and as your role involves more and more cross-functional work, you should expect some cross-functional interviews as well, where you talk to engineers or designers, operations, again, depending on the role in the company, some cross-functional partners to make sure that you'd work well alongside them. Great. So now some general advice on how to pass interviews, like kind of at a high level before we jump into specific types of problems. So no matter what interview session you're doing, no matter what type it is, it's always important to have a structured approach to every answer that you give. For example, if I'm going to answer a product sense question, I would start off by explaining to the interviewer that I'm going to start by talking about, let's say, the goal, and then the users, and then like a North Star metric, and then brainstorm solutions, and then prioritize a good one to dive into, and say all of that, and no more, no less, just kind of give them the overall structure at the very beginning and follow it all the way through. It's also important to be clearly communicative with the interviewer which step of that framework you're going through so that they can easily follow along where you are. Now, something that trips up a lot of folks is that they do a lot of work to memorize some framework, and they jump in and they know exactly how they're going to approach it. But that usually is not going to pan out well, in particular if your interviewer is well calibrated and throws different curveballs or questions to try to throw you off your feet. The goal is not to regurgitate a framework that you don't fully understand. The goal is to have some guideline that you generally follow that you're able to be adaptive with. Another huge thing to think about is to check in frequently with your interviewer throughout the interview. Every step of the way, check in and ask, does this make sense? Any questions or any pushes around how I've been approaching the problem? If you do that, it gives the interviewer a chance to course correct and make sure that they're getting signal on what they want to get out of the interview. It also shows them that you are really engaged and that you want them to be engaged with you as well. A couple of final thoughts here is make sure that you're humble. These questions are really tough. There's no expectation that you'll have a perfect answer. No one does, no matter how experienced or talented you are. So do your best and be willing to receive pushback and be open to it, and even thank them for the feedback. So a couple of thoughts on how to not pass the interview. So these are red flags that if you get caught doing, there's a very good chance that you're going to fail the interview. So one of the biggest ones that a lot of folks do is they get asked a question that should start off at a fairly high level, of abstraction, but you jump straight in and give some specific solution. Classic example of that might be if you get asked what your favorite product is, and you give some answer. Like for me, I usually say Headspace, for example, the meditation app. Then they ask me, how I'd improve it, and I jump straight into oh, they should add whatever, more social features. Or it really doesn't matter. If you give any answer like that without first grounding in what the overall mission of the product that you like is and what user value they generally provide, if you don't do that, then any answer that you give is going to come off like you haven't really critically thought through it. And same idea with the second bullet here is if you go straight to solutions without understanding the why. Also, as mentioned before, if you don't go into the interview with a well-structured framework, and if it comes off like you're rambling or that you kind of jump in and out of different topics, it's going to come off like you're not well-structured in your approach, and that's going to not work out too well either. And then finally, again, you should be adaptive and you should be humble. So if your interviewer pushes back, be open and be willing to change course and adapt to whatever they're pushing you on. The one thought there is maybe don't do too much of that. This is a bit vague, but it really does depend on the situation, and you want to be adaptable to literally whatever the interviewer is doing in that moment with you. But each of us should have our own gut feel for if we're bending over backwards too much for all of the different pushes that the interviewer is giving, versus if we're way too rigid and unwilling to compromise. There's some middle ground, and you can feel it out with your interviewer, but should be actively trying to find that middle ground. Great. So now we're going to go into specific types of interview questions. So the first one is the product sense question. And I'll throw in some stuff on the strategy side towards the end here as well. So the high level thing here that they're looking for around the product sense question is if you have a structured approach, some framework to grounding the usually ambiguous and abstract product design question that you were asked around high level goals and user needs. And that you focus on the user and their needs the whole way through the problem, constantly coming back to the needs and the goals, rather than focusing on the business value first and foremost, or on some specific solution that you personally think is cool. It also is important towards the end to be able to prioritize a specific solution. And if you have enough time, depending on the interviewer and what they want to get out of the interview, sometimes you want to go into the actual details and show off your creativity. But it's actually the least important part. The most important part is doing this structured approach and setting the goals and the user needs. So make sure that you're focused on that during the interview. The types of questions you may be asked, I kept it kind of vague over here, but you can imagine designing some arbitrary product for a new user segment. This could be Lyft for kids or Airbnb for seniors. This could be something like an alarm clock for blind individuals, something that you may have heard in some videos, for example. Another way that you could be asked is that you're the PM for some existing product at a company. So if you're interviewing at Google, maybe they'll ask you, imagine that you're the PM for Google Maps. or more specifically for the like walking experience on Google Maps? How would you think about improving that? And the third one, kind of a classic one, is what's your favorite product and why? And also, how would you improve it? This one comes off like it's a bit different than the other ones, but it's actually the exact same thing. And your answer should be very, very similar. It should be still grounded in the goal and the user needs, and not in why you personally like it, but why you respect the general goals and mission and user demographic that the company or that product is going after. And I'm not going to go through this entire thing in detail. Again, you'll have the document shared afterwards to dive in really deep. But the high-level framework that I usually use to approach these problems, which again should be adaptive to whatever the question at hand is, should be first of all, start off with the goal and the mission. If you're being asked about, Facebook events and how you'd improve that, start off with Facebook and what Facebook's overall goal is. Let's say, to build community and give people the tools to create their own community, right? Like something like that, right? After establishing the overall mission, and maybe also getting one level deeper to the specific part of the company you're being asked to think about. So again, with the Facebook example, let's say that you're being asked to think about some feature for Facebook events. You can also ground the event specific product and say that the mission of the events product is to facilitate offline and virtual community interactions across Facebook or whatever, but grounding in something like that, right? The next step would be talking about users and their needs. So this would be figuring out the specific user groups, like at a high level, that you want to brainstorm needs for. So one thing to avoid here is you don't want to focus too much on like demographics. Like I wouldn't actually lean towards, for example, breaking it down based on like seniors and teenagers and so forth. A better example might be, let's say you're thinking about ideas for like Lyft or Uber. You'd want to focus on the riders and the drivers, right? Or if you're talking about like eBay or like Facebook Marketplace or Amazon, there's like the merchant and there's the buyer, for example, right? You want to usually focus on that. One thing that'd be interesting to also explore here, usually, depending on the problem, is what sort of user interactions are the most popular with this app. In other words, like what real life scenarios are people in where they are using this product that you're being asked to brainstorm for. After that is setting a really, really high level North Star for solving those user problems. And a way that I usually think about it is imagine that like this product didn't yet exist. So like as an example, if we're talking about, again, about Facebook events, imagine a world where Facebook is a bit earlier on in their lifetime and they have not yet launched a events product. And now all of a sudden they've launched this new thing called Facebook events. And they ran it as like an A/B test. So there's a control group without events at all. And there's a variant group that has the events product. You would hope that the existence of this new product would move some very high level thing for Facebook. And usually for a lot of companies that are already mature, this is going to boil down to something like retention or engagement. It depends on the company. At a transactional company, like a Lyft or like an e-commerce company, maybe it's like the gross bookings or the transaction volume or something like that. But you want to pick something really high level. Don't get too deep here into the success metrics. That happens later on, but just have something high level that you'll be able to prioritize with later on. Once you have all this stuff, then you want to brainstorm some solutions that are grounded in the mission, the user values, and this North Star metric. This is a good chance for you to show off creativity, but it also should hopefully feel a lot smoother and easier to talk through if you've already grounded it in all of the above. Once you have these, prioritize them based on the high-level North Star as the impact, and also factor in the cost to develop it, and choose the thing that has the greatest ratio typically. Again, depends on the context. You shouldn't like do this every single time, but that's usually a good framework to start off with at least. Once you pick a problem or a solution to go with, then now is a chance to go deeper on the success criteria. And these should be considered like proxy metrics or like leading indicators for the North Star metric that you actually care about, but that will take a lot longer to get results from. And then finally, at the end, this is another high-level thing that you might want to apply across any question, is think about some of the trade-offs or the risks with your recommended approach. Again, be humble. Like, we're not going to get this perfectly right, no matter who we are, no matter what the situation is. There's always more that you could think about. It's like a 45-minute long interview usually. So take a second at the end to think about some reasons why you might be wrong and showcase that humility to your interviewer. Next up, we'll go into execution. So this is a bit more varied. It depends on the company. The ways that I'm approaching it here is very similar to how Facebook and also Lyft approach interviews. But depending on the company, their approach might be a bit more analytical, for example, or less. But in most companies, what they're looking for with execution is how you prioritize and identify different opportunities, and how you analyze a set of constraints, and come up with some set of goals or success criteria for a product area, and how you might be able to adapt plans or troubleshoot problems to figure out what is going on with the product. And all this stuff might sound kind of vague. We'll ground it in a second. But essentially all this comes down to is if you're like in the trenches working with a team to deliver value to your user and something happens across the way, you want to make sure that your team, your team gets confused and they need help understanding what they're working on, or something goes wrong along the way, that you're the sort of person who could guide the team to have a good understanding of what goals they should be chasing after. There's three major ways that these questions are asked. There's a goal setting question, there's a trade-off question, and we'll get into troubleshooting in a second. And all these have fairly different frameworks that all kind of get the same sort of stuff. So for the goal setting question, so the initial part of it can be a bit similar to the product sense question, where you start off by talking about the mission of the company. You start off by grounding it in some North Star metric potentially, and the user value, very similar to the product sense question. And then most of your time after that point, rather than brainstorming solutions or being creative about like how to solve their problems, you think more about how you would know that you succeeded. And a typical way this might be asked is, let's say you're a product manager at Spotify and you're the PM for like the playlists feature. What would your dashboard be? This is like how the question might be like asked to you. And your job then would be to ground the interviewer in what the like North Star metric is, like what like the high level thing that actually matters for Spotify playlists, but also to fill out a larger set of leading indicators or proxy metrics that help you to understand if that main thing that you care about is moving in the right direction. And again, you can read this later, but there's a lot of different ways to think about how to break apart different types of metrics that ultimately lead up to that North Star. Another type of question is a trade-off question. And this is usually like how do you decide between one thing versus another. Classic examples of that, if you read enough product interview blog posts or videos, you'll probably end up coming across a like classic Facebook question, which is if you're the PM of the newsfeed and you have to pick between either showing a advertisement or a people you may know module that suggests new friends to add, how do you decide which one of those to show? This could come up in a variety of different ways. Like a Lyft or Uber, it might be around something that trades off between the drivers and the riders. With like Amazon, it could be trading off the merchant and the buyer. But in all these cases, there's some apples and oranges comparison where your job is to find like a unifying factor to then make decisions off of. And the idea here is really three stages. One, figure out what that trade-off is by plugging in like infinity into this like equation and think about like extremes. So an example of like the Facebook ads and people you may know question, maybe you'd want to imagine a world where you only show ads and you never show people you may know, and vice versa. And you'll quickly find that in one situation, you have a ton of engagement, but no revenue ever, because there's never any ads. On the other side, you have some short-term revenue, but long-term people churn and you don't make money. Then you can get into step two, which is what's the like objective function or the main goal. And this, in the case of this people you may know and ads thing, might be long-term revenue, depending on whatever question it is. It could be something different, but there's some like long-term unifying metric that you care about. And then you have like some MVP solution, which could be, let's say, like run an A/B test with different ratios of, let's say, ads and people you may know modules, and you pick the variant that has the best like long-term, let's say like 6-month revenue, for example. And then after that, you get into like a further optimization section. And again, in the case of like the Facebook feed people you may know and ads question, this could be factoring in things like how many friends the person already has, how many friends the other person has. Like maybe you want to get the person to, even if they have a lot of friends themselves, to get some like a newer Facebook member to increase their friends and grow the network effect. Maybe there's something around like geolocation, or you can really go crazy here and come up with a bunch of different ideas. But the most important parts are that first and second part, where you establish you understand the fundamental trade-off. And then you've kind of earned the interviewer's trust to dive into a bunch of different options. The third question that usually get asked here is around root cause analysis. And this is stuff like if you're at Lyft, let's say, like cancels are up 5%, like what happened? Or at Facebook, it might be group posts are down 10%, what happened? All these are the same thing. And one thing worth noting here is there's no right answer. Your goal should not be to find a correct answer to the question. It should be to, again, explain to the interviewer how you would systematically and in a structured fashion go through all the possible outcomes. And you want to figure out some like high level set of categories. For example, like technical attributes, region, time frame, different like product features that may have changed, demographic. These are some that I usually use, but there could be any other combination of things. And you want to walk through each of those one by one and dig through the entire list of things that could relate to that specific category. Your interviewer will probably never say that you found the reason why. But like if actually, as an example, when I run these sort of interviews and the interviewee is on track to find the right answer, I just changed the answer because my goal is not for them to find the right answer. It's to see like how holistic and exhaustive they can be. So again, all these things come down to, do you have a mastery of metrics? Can you talk through like how to make trade-offs? And if you can, study these kind of three main types of questions, then you'll be able to do fairly well no matter what they ask you. The next classic one is around behavior and leadership. I'll skip through this one kind of quickly. So it's a little more qualitative, and it takes a long time to really think through this one. But this one really comes down to like what sort of person you are when you're with a team, how you approach resolving conflict, how you approach motivating teams to do really good work. You can check this doc out later for some example questions, but at a high level, the sort of things that matter for you to exhibit here are you humble? Are you able to represent, that you had a meaningful impact on driving the project forward that you've worked on, but that you're also team oriented and recognize that you couldn't have done it by yourself, and that a lot of the work came from all the engineers and designers and operations folks and everyone else who's in the picture, right? One of the biggest mistakes you can make here is focus too much on like yourself, on like I, and on we, right? And hopefully you genuinely believe that, like it is true for everyone that these sort of things happen from an entire team collaborating effectively. One other typical one here is around resolving conflict. The quick thing I'll say here, and again, it's more of it's on this doc itself, but the quick thing there is when you're trying to resolve conflict, you want to make sure that there's some like high level framework for solving the problem that everyone agrees on. So it's less about the tactical thing that you're talking about as a team, but more about the prioritization framework or the like goals that the team overall cares about. And if you can all agree on whatever that is, then it's a lot easier to when you're like on the ground making tactical decisions for a specific feature that you're shipping to make the right decision because it's grounded in some high level thing that you've already agreed in. I'll quickly cover technical and estimation in case there's anyone here who wants to interview basically Google. There are a ton of other companies that do this. I think Stripe does, and maybe a couple other ones. Obviously, startups have like full reign to do whatever they want. The typical approach to technical is don't expect it to be like a coding exercise. The most important thing in these sort of interviews is just that you are able to earn engineers' trust and that you are familiar enough with technical architecture to ask good questions and help the engineering team to generally match the technical guardrails and constraints of what they're working on with whatever the user need is. So typical questions here you might be asked are talk about a time that you worked closely with the engineering team to solve a deeply technical problem and like how well you understand it. And again, you shouldn't explain like the code or the stack. Like it doesn't matter if they use Python or Ruby or whatever. It's more about like the overall like system that you designed and what high level considerations like latency or like content freshness, or these are random terms that I'm throwing out right now, but you want to think about like high level things that are really around like the user value, but that you solve through like a technical approach. In some companies, you may be asked to look at some like pseudocode or some like really high level like set of commands that accomplish some goal and explain what it does. You might see this at Google, but you're really not going to see this at most companies, so I wouldn't really worry too much about it. Something that like you might see probably again like not at like Google or not at like Facebook or at like Lyft or Uber. You might see it at Google, maybe some startups, is explaining some technical process in at least like an explain like on 5 sort of a level of detail. This could be like explain like how APIs work, or explain like what happens when you hit when you load a web page on your computer or phone, and kind of talk through all like the technical interactions that lead to it. But again, you should not expect this to be asked in most companies that you're interviewing at. One final type of question is this estimation problem. You really shouldn't expect this to happen in most companies. Again, Google does this, but most companies don't. It really comes down to like you'll be asked some like really crazy problem that I at least find really fun, but I think a lot of folks might find this kind of out there. This could be something like how much does the school bus weigh, or like if you are Apple, let's say, competing with Google Maps and you want to launch your own version of Street View, and you buy some autonomous vehicles to like year-round map the entire country of America, like how many vehicles do you need to buy? Like that's like a super vague question that's like really hard to answer, obviously. And there are ways to make it easier. And the way that you do it, again, it's all in the doc. But it comes down to a couple different steps. First, you want to scope the problem and make sure, we're talking about just America, or if we're talking about like an airplane and how much it weighs, like, are there people in the plane? I ask those sort of questions to make sure that you're being thoughtful. Once you have that sort of stuff laid out, then it really comes down to breaking down the problem into a couple different steps. So for example, in the autonomous vehicle side, like how much road is there? What are like the speed limits? Can cars drive 24/7, or are they not able to when it's like dark outside, for example, stuff like that. break down like a bunch of subcomponents, and then eventually you can add all of you can estimate each of them separately, then add all of them together to get your answer. This is one of the most important types of questions, to be really humble and to think through why you might be wrong, because like no one's going to get this right. Like you're not expected to accurately estimate. If you're like within an order of magnitude, you're doing a great job. And that's it for the different types of interviews. Now, let's say that you finish the interview and it's time to kind of think about next steps. Really what you need to do is, first of all, like thank folks for their time. It's funny enough, like I've interviewed probably like over 100 people, especially when I was at Lyft, but in other companies as well. And I think I've been thanked like maybe 5 times. Like almost nobody sends an email to thank you for your time. I personally do it every single time, and I've heard feedback that it's really helpful. I think like the more that you do it, the better. And then just wait patiently. It may take, depending on how big the company is, like 1 or 2 weeks, maybe more. You can check in like once a week, maybe, just to make sure with the recruiter that like things are on track. But make sure that you're just patient and you wait. And then eventually when you hear back, if you got the job, awesome, good job. There's a lot of different ways to move forward. You can like get help on negotiating. There's some thoughts on the doc that you can read later. If you don't get the job, totally fine. Happens to everyone. Again, no matter how experienced you are, like I teach people how to interview, and I still don't get jobs sometimes when I interview. Like everyone will get rejected. If that happens, make sure you get feedback on what you could have done better. And something that most people don't do that I think is super important to think about is leverage the opportunity that you had to meet some awesome people at some company that you care about, to make some new connections. Even if you didn't get the job, a lot of folks that you interviewed with are very likely to be willing to at least answer some questions on what you could have done better. If you're really excited and passionate about their company, maybe they'll even be willing to like develop a like mentorship relationship over time. One quick story there as an example is I was interviewing at a company a long time ago, probably like 4 or so years ago, and I didn't get the offer. But one of the people that I interviewed with and I hit it off, and we actually became like friends, and we've hung out a couple times since. And when I went to go work at like the next company that I joined, they were working at a similar company in the same space. So we talked a lot about the similarities and the problems they were trying to solve. And eventually, he actually ended up referring me into his company, and I got the job there. And I ended up, joining this company primarily because this person who I interviewed with like a couple of years prior, vouched for me internally and got me the job. And that wouldn't have happened if I had just kind of left it there after getting rejected from that company several years ago. So huge opportunity to network essentially. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for listening. Again, this doc is going to be shared out. You can feel free to read it. There are some practice problems that I'll highlight in a second that you could, if you copy over this doc into your own version, you can actually like work through the problems yourself. And put some links here. Feel free to like email me or reach out to me on Twitter or anywhere else. Happy to answer any questions and have more conversations. The last thought here, again, for folks offline, like once you're done watching this, is if you were to copy over the doc and go through some practice problems, I've added some example problems that you can write through, and you can actually like type in your answers over here if you copy it for yourself. And there are some additional considerations, kind of curveballs that you maybe didn't think about that you can work through as you prepare. And that is all.